Hola, buenos días a todos y gracias por por la invitación a Crea Urbe y la ciudad de Guatemala. Um, Estoy muy feliz de estar aquí con todos ustedes. My name is Jeremy Siegel, and I am an architect and urbanist with Bjarke Ingels Group. And I'm an urbanist because I believe in cities. I really appreciate the mayor's words about the productivity of cities. I think they're humanity's greatest invention to date. They're where so much of our productivity takes place. And that's because they're places that we share things. We share resources, we share ideas, we share stories, we share history. And so while cities are very much challenged by the population growth that they're experiencing and by a lot of the other challenges that they're facing globally, I also think they're kind of the clearest way through the problems that we face. And there are challenges there, but they're challenges that designers like ourselves and developers and urban thinkers like you all, I think, really relish in tackling. So very happy to be here on behalf of myself and BIG. I'm going to start today by introducing a little bit about ourselves. I'm going to get into some of the elements of cities that we've been looking at around the world. And then towards the end of the presentation, I'm going to talk about how those ideas can land in a place like Guatemala City, using the example of Barranquilla, Colombia, that we've been working in for the last several years. So to start, Bjarke Ingels Group is a group of 700 designers, researchers, urbanists, landscape architects, engineers. We're based in 5 countries around the world. I'm from our New York office, but we really got our start in Copenhagen, which is a place that, as many of you may know, has really had a spirit of urban innovation over the last many decades. Our work was sort of part of that movement in the last 20 years. This is one of our first projects, the harbor bath, that was built on the occasion that the harbor finally became so clean that you could swim in it. This is a famous Colombian swimmer diving in. And shortly after this, my colleague Bjarke and about now 150 or 200 others of us dove into New York City and started to put some of those ideas into practice. But we really work iteratively. We like to think about many different ideas and many different approaches to a particular problem. We work across sectors from landscape to engineering, architecture, products, and planning. And we work across scales, everything from light bulbs and sofas to cities and regional plans. But we got our start in a really important component of cities, as the mayor pointed out, which is housing, particularly looking at the issue of middle and lower income housing and how to innovate within that space. Some of our first projects include the VM House, which really looked at how to take a quite standard building and through very simple manipulations of apartment layout provide a great deal of variety for a great deal of living situations, whether they're a single person, a family of 5, a new family of 2 or 3. And that also started to use very standard components, but in a playful way to create variety, interest, as well as community. During COVID, the community members here would sort of hang out on their balconies and speak to one another vertically, diagonally, horizontally, etc. Other projects looking at parking, sort of in this one, rather than having a parking structure next to a tower, we took the parking and put it underneath the housing, which then created this kind of cathedral for the cars, but then also great views for all of the residents above. Creating community in even more kind of 3-dimensional ways here with the 8 House nearby in Copenhagen. Where essentially we took a pedestrian street and really brought it up and through this building as kind of a 3-dimensional city where townhomes, where kids can play, where you can meet your neighbor, and where there's a real sense of place in what might otherwise be a large and sort of anonymous building. More recently, we've been looking into even more modular methods. So this is a system that we've developed and are now implementing in a few projects. It's a very modular and simple construction method. Underneath these, there's just a very simple set of prefabricated concrete slabs that are acting both as structure and partition. And then through very simple materials, we're able to create really great qualities. And this is low-income housing. And here we were able to get a few extra feet of head height in the spaces between the modules, so really dignified spaces, and very popular ones. This is the line that was stretching down the block when these houses were put onto the list, basically, for residents. And then expanding that also into student housing. This is a system that we've developed with a group called A Place To for student-oriented housing. These are placed at major infrastructure nodes. This is a kind of metro and subway station in Copenhagen. And again, through very simple prefabricated elements, a very simple core, a very simple set of elements that are then repeated but varied in their repetition, you get really a lot more variety and interest in something that actually has quite a good economic basis to it. We've also been experimenting with public space. So Superkillen in Copenhagen was one of our first parks. And this was built basically on a disused railway line where the surroundings were basically the most diverse place in Copenhagen, where you had hundreds of nationalities living there. And so rather than sort of just come up with a design ourselves, we actually took the design process and made that the engagement process. We worked with community members from hundreds of countries, and we basically translated that into a series of urban furnishings that each came from those respective countries to really kind of reflect the diversity of the neighborhood around it. We placed those throughout the 1.5 kilometers of the park. And so today you have basically palm trees, you have the bike path, you have a fountain from Morocco and benches from Belgium. You have a sound system that you can plug your iPhone into from Jamaica. We have a Thai boxing ring. We have a bus stop from Kazakhstan. This octopus from Japan. Seats from Mexico. And so in terms of that sort of international bearing on our work, we do work all over the world, including in Central and South America. One of our first projects was this community of residences in the Bahamas surrounding a recording studio. We've also been bringing some of our ideas about housing to Quito, Ecuador, where we're building 2 major structures. This is the Epic Residential Tower, which really creates a series of outdoor communal gathering spaces along its height. That's under construction. As well as the Icon Tower, which is technically one of the largest, the tallest buildings in the world, because it's at a very high elevation, and it is the highest building in Quito. And for this one, the concept was that every apartment should have a garden, even though it's a 20 to 30-story building, and that every garden should have a tree. So the architecture itself, you can see with these kind of manipulations here, create the soil depth that you need for a healthy tree. So that's sort of a lot of our underpinnings as an architecture firm, but we've really been interested in this idea of social infrastructure for the last decade. And by that we mean infrastructure that serves multiple purposes, right? That's not just working to serve engineering or purely kind of utilitarian goals, but that is really looking at social, economic, and ecological health of cities. And cities, as we've said, are these places where we share things, and so a lot of those synergies are where you find the efficiencies and the strength of cities. So this idea of social infrastructure can take many forms. Here, a very simple one. This is what we call dragon scale offices in California, where basically we have a 5 megawatt power plant with an office space underneath. And we've developed this solar panel system such that it's low reflectivity, and you sort of wouldn't know it's a solar panel, but this is generating more than half of the building's electricity. In Copenhagen, we've been recently completing a waste-to-energy plant, which takes 500,000 tons of waste per year from Copenhagen and then converts that into electricity for 500,000 citizens. So it's a facility that at its inception was oriented around trash, that was oriented around a lot of processing machinery, the kind of place that normally would be off and separate and distant and not have any relationship to the city itself. But our proposal, which was eventually the winner and was adopted, was to take this and make it a more social place. Firstly, there's administrative and research spaces associated with it. But we realized that it would actually be the tallest structure in Copenhagen once it were built. Copenhagen is a place with a lot of snow in the winter, but not a lot of hills. And so we proposed and have realized a ski slope on top of this waste-to-energy plant, which accommodates a black, a blue, and a green slope. We developed a surface with the same friction coefficient as snow that's synthetic, so you can ski year-round. And so today you have really a destination in a part of the city that otherwise would not be. So you have pro skiers and snowboarders here, all kinds of events. These are photos. It's real. You essentially have a man-made hiking grounds now in the city at its edge. New views over the city, and really kind of an unexpected destination that comes from thinking about more than just engineering uses for our infrastructure. Lastly, we have the world's tallest climbing wall at 200 meters here. So when we moved to New York about 12 years ago, we also started to take these ideas and implement them in the context, the very new context of America and New York City. The Big U is a project that I have been deeply involved with for the last decade since its inception, which really came from the crisis of flooding during Hurricane Sandy, and the great deal of investment that we knew would need to go into the city to prevent something like this from happening again, which really destroyed the city economically for many weeks and for some neighborhoods, months or years. The hurricane created a new neighborhood for New York, Sopo, south of Power, which is where all the power went out famously, and which was basically born out of the fact that the Dutch and the British had been filling in the river for many centuries, and that all those areas of fill were very low. So we knew that something would need to take place here. We knew that there would be some kind of a barrier that would need to be built, but we thought it would be a disaster of another kind if the wall that we then used to keep the water out also kept the city away from its newly rediscovered waterfront. So we really looked at something like the High Line as a piece of infrastructure which was sort of retroactively made into a park, and really thought about how we could do that as a proactive measure, that we could integrate those kinds of social functions from day one. So thinking about this geography, we thought about the scale of the neighborhoods that run through this. We thought about the scale of the flooding and that we have these natural pinch points. And taking a really big problem and then breaking it down into smaller components, we developed a series of compartments. Each of these can be built in one go, and you can sort of build the system up slowly over time. And so to do this, we also had a process. The process was very much integrated with the communities. There are many NGOs running this waterfront, as well as many federal, state, city, and private stakeholders. And through a really exhaustive series of workshops over many months and inevitably many years, we developed a focus on the lowest income area of 130,000 residents. We worked with the local community groups and sort of brought our design process out into the public using physical models to build consensus and to talk about different options. And really to sort of come to a more specific understanding of what could take place along this waterfront that could keep the water out, but act as an amenity for the city 365 days a year. Try to advance here. I think it might be that the videos are not running, but that's okay. I'm going to keep going here. So The result of that was a $335 million award by the federal government to the city of New York. Here you have the governor, the senior senator, the mayor announcing this, and we started work on the first phase, the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project. This is, you can see it for scale here with respect to Central Park and other parks in New York City. So this is a major new undertaking for New York City. On a waterfront that has a long history, one that was very much connected to its waterfront in the past, but that more recently has been cut off from its waterfront by the highway, and that faces real resiliency challenges along its length. Is there a way to have the videos run, or no? Okay. So basically the idea is to create a park that keeps the water out, that elevates itself out of the floodplain, but that accommodates a whole host of activities, sort of raising the landscape, and then accommodating both active and passive recreation, and really working with the communities to understand what those needs should be. So here the existing condition in the new elevated park with new bridges across the FDR highway. The park will then protect the neighborhood in the case of a storm, new connections, amphitheaters, new play areas, new facilities such as bathrooms and comfort stations. And so this is under construction. This is a fully funded $1.5 billion capital project that we just started construction on last year. Our mayor, Mayor Adams, recently opened the first segment in the north, and we're really excited about this. We've also recently begun work on the western portion, Battery Park City, and that'll be a 3-year design process. So thinking about infrastructure, other kinds of infrastructure, we've also been looking at mobility infrastructure and highways in New York City. The BQE famously has this triple cantilever segment, which sort of is in great disrepair. The city was looking at ways to repair it, and many of them were really looking at only thinking about the roadway and infrastructure and not really layering any other benefits on top. So Mayor Adams, when he was the borough president, as well as the community, sort of worked with us and came to us asking if we could help them develop a new plan. So working very much with all of these groups, we looked at the area and we discovered that if you could work across multiple jurisdictions, working from the highway, but also working within the park, you could create essentially a new roadway below the existing roadway, and then create more park on top of that highway, and then decommission the existing highway, and then convert that into yet more parkland. So a huge transformation for this area. With new connections from the waterfront down. Our office is just around the corner here. And we're very pleased that after 3 years of community engagement and work, the city has sort of adopted a new approach, and we'll be working with the city over the next several years to reimagine this central stretch from Cobble Hill up to Dumbo. And then the city will be looking at a much broader vision for the corridor on the whole. Thinking about mobility, the Brooklyn Bridge is really something that's emblematic of our mobility infrastructure. This is sort of an early view taken by Thomas Edison running along the trainway. And basically today you have extreme overcrowding on this bridge. And so City Council during COVID asked for ideas about how we could help make it that when the bridge reopened, sort of after COVID, we could accommodate a different set of demands on the bridge. It's also a place where you saw during a lot of our protests and events, people coming and just sort of taking the bridge over, taking the streets back. See that here? And if you look at the history of the bridge, what you find is that originally, when it was first built, it was primarily trains. There was heavy rail, light rail, a tolled road, meaning you had to pay for the use of horse-drawn carriages, and then in the central area there, a space for people and bikes. And at that time, this bridge carried 425,000 people per day. This is when the population of the city was roughly 1 million. Today, a short interlude. So in the 1950s, our enlightened city planner, Robert Moses, destroyed the mass transit infrastructure. The streetcar terminals at either end were demolished, and the bridge was converted into vehicular only cars. So today, in a city that has 8 million people, the bridge only carries 160,000 people per day, roughly 1/3 of its original capacity, which means that the bridge is maybe good at carrying cars, but it is very bad at carrying people. And that's because the throughput of a typical car lane is roughly 1/5 or 1/6 that of the same lane used for bikes or for public transit. So our idea here was to sort of go back to the future and to say that on the Brooklyn Bridge in the future, we might have no cars, and then to develop an incremental plan for how to get there. If you look at our uptake of biking in New York City, that's here on the right, you can see that we're only at 1% commuting today. In Copenhagen, we're at 62%. And that's not by accident. That's been through decades of policy and change to infrastructure. So if we could even get to 10%, we'd really be able to change the way the city moves and help bring a lot of our capacity problems on our roadways and our subway infrastructure to give them some relief. So basically we looked here at an incremental plan which would start slowly by first replacing only one lane in each direction with a bike lane, and then over time convert the northbound lanes into bus rapid transit connecting downtown Manhattan to downtown Brooklyn, and then eventually turning the entire southern roadway into an elevated plaza in the sky with views over the southern harbor. And eventually thinking about other forms of collective transit, such as smaller, more autonomous vehicles of the type that we've been working with Toyota in Japan on. So from a condition like this to one of more efficient and effective mass transit, these pictures were taken during some of the protests, and basically locking these changes in, creating maybe very light touch interventions on weekends, for example, with food trucks and movable furniture, but then over time locking these improvements in with serious capital projects. And then thinking about a range of activities over the course of the year. The other thing about this is that there is so much car infrastructure serving this bridge that really chokes the adjacent areas, that we would gain another 35 acres of open space by taking cars off of this bridge. So we took this idea and then started to expand it beyond the bridge itself, thinking about a network of people streets that could sort of act as a set of arteries for the city that would take car-centric streets like this one, and then over time, with the adding of shade to make for comfortable biking, and eventually mass transit, really start to capture some of the benefits of these kinds of places. The benefits on increased pedestrian movement and biking on local economies, on public health, both physical and mental, on rainwater and environmental filtration. And we're really pleased that the city adopted this suggestion and recently opened the first lane on the northbound side, and we're looking forward to more. So those are some of our kind of experimentations with this kind of work in the New York City context. Recently over COVID, I had the opportunity to live in and work with the state of Penang in Malaysia on an extension of their city, an extension of roughly 500,000 people on a series of 3 islands below the island of Penang. Very much a developing context. And what was great about this is it really gave us the opportunity to take so many of the ideas we've been developing and see how they might land together in one new development. So after the competition win, We basically worked intensively with the public-private partnership on this for a year, really developing the technical and economic feasibility. And we came up with a framework that I'll take you through some of the elements of, because I think there's things to learn here, both in the creation of new cities and in their implementation for existing cities. Firstly, compact neighborhoods of the type that the mayor and others have been discussing. So we really thought about 15-minute neighborhoods where living, working, and play might all be had within a quick bike or walk of your apartment. Important to that, in a context where gated development is really the predominant typology, we were really clear about the fact that we wanted to create a series of continuous routes that were completely public throughout the city on a roughly 350-meter grid. And then we align that grid to prevailing winds to basically create a series of wind corridors to help flush this area, which is on the equator, out as urban heat increases. We developed a series of green-blue canalways that actually sit below the grade of the existing city. As I've driven around Guatemala City, when I've seen the barrancos, I've really thought of this, because the whole idea here was that by using these canals as major bike arteries, you would be able to get from anywhere in the city to anywhere else in the city without crossing a single road. And that's a major factor in safety, in people adopting biking, and eventually being able to do it quickly, particularly with electric biking. So I think there's a big opportunity for that in Guatemala City here. And it's something that we explored in Penang. Importantly then were our streets and our streetscapes. So this isn't just a pretty picture. This is a highly measured, contested, and eventually agreed upon cross-section involving utilities underneath, bioswales running through, sort of buffering from the roadway to the bikeway and the pedestrian way, making sure that we have covered walkways, eyes on the street, making sure that buildings are sort of up against the street so that streets feel safe. And importantly also in this is being able to transfer between modes. So having biking, having public transit, having buses, but then having nodes where you can really efficiently transfer from one mode to another, and that transfer isn't so onerous that it makes you just stay in your car from home to your destination. So with those elements, particularly the transportation piece, we were able to get to a 70% public and personal transit mix, which was able to get us down to a 40% reduction in carbon emissions from a baseline development, and a place that really has different qualities than a lot of the developments that you see in Malaysia today. This is currently under implementation. So now I'm going to sort of come to a context that's much closer to home, Barranquilla, in Colombia, where we've been working with both the state and the city to take many of these ideas and sort of have them land in an existing context. For those of you who haven't been to Barranquilla, it occupies a really interesting position in the country. It's both part of South America, but it really considers itself part of the Caribbean. They call themselves the Puerta de Oro, the Golden Gate. They sit at the edge of the Caribbean Sea and the Rio Magdalena, which is sort of their major river, much like New York City, where we have the Hudson intersecting with the Atlantic. Today it's the fourth largest city in Colombia, but it's growing. And so we were commissioned on the occasion of their Segunda Circunvalar being built, and questions about what would happen around that infrastructure. For a little bit of history, Barranquilla has been a city of firsts. It had Colombia's principal port for many decades, the first airport in the Americas. It was Colombia's second largest city, so really benefited from its external orientation, and really had a diverse set of immigrants and residents because of that, one of whom famously is Shakira. You'll hear her give shout-outs to Barranquilla often. And so during the later 20th century, the city really started to turn inward as the security situation in the country was sort of worsened. And the economic policy of the country really turned inward. Barranquilla really suffered from that. But from the 90s onward, it has started to globalize and it has started to grow. It's now a booming place. And it's interesting to look at how that growth has actually happened spatially. So these are the three original settlements, pre-Hispanic, in the area. This is the kind of colonial settlement here in 1821. The next sort of 100 years led to a relatively compact city. And you can see even in the next 50 years, so through that whole second half of the 20th century, very compact development. And that's because of, we were working with this, on this project with the NYU Marin Institute, who spoke about the invisible wall, that with the security situation in the country, the city really sort of stayed compact, and people were, even through the 90s, were sort of loath to move too far out of the city. But with growth has come actually very quickly sort of explosive spatial growth and land consumption. And so at just the right time, the state and the city came to us and asked us if we could prepare a plan for how these territories could grow in such a way that essentially with foresight, we could make sure that informal sprawl weren't the result. You can see here that roadway, which is a tolled road. And although this land looks pristine, it's actually fully privately owned. This is the actual land ownership overlaid on the area. So in a sort of do-nothing scenario, you might imagine that individual developments would start to occur around this infrastructure, but eventually you would end up with something that wasn't optimized for the collective and that didn't have open space and other infrastructural needs met. And this is something that the municipality and the state government clearly did not want. So interestingly, the city of Barranquilla, much like Guatemala City, is surrounded by a series of other municipalities which are accounting for about half of the area's population and a lot of the growth of the place. So here you can see in blue is Barranquilla's population, the municipality itself, which is pretty much stable and is projected to be stable through the next 50 years or so. But then you can see a lot of expected growth, most of the expected growth happening in the other municipalities of Soledad, Malambo, Puerto Colombia, and Galapa. Up to about 3 million expected by between 2050 and 2100. Land consumption is increasing as a result. But these municipalities have very different economies, both in terms of their scale. So these circles represent the different sectors of each municipality, but also their relative scale in terms of GDP. So different focuses and very different strengths and weaknesses between them. Places that are more focused on, for example, manufacturing or logistics, places that are more balanced with a heavier focus on services or tourism. And then very unequal coverage of services. So here you can see that Barranquilla itself is relatively well covered in terms of health, education, water, and sewerage, but you have really big disparities. There's sort of a citywide health program that was rolled out recently that I think has really helped bring them all to an equal place, but in things like sewerage, water, and even education, big disparities. So sort of the first goal and the first piece of the work was to think about how we could physically knit these 5 municipalities into one metropolis. We looked at things being both architects and planners at a series of scales, from that of the house to the street to the neighborhood, the small village to the metropolis and the region. Through exhaustive analysis over many months, as well as a lot of community engagement, we really started to understand the challenges and opportunities in the place. And speaking with people, I think, as you could tell from our work in New York, is something that's really important to us in everything that we do. In our conversations in Barranquilla, we heard about, a lot about linkages between the environment and the economy, that the health of the rivers has a direct impact on the livelihood of the fishermen and others that surround them. The needs of different types of people, like children or the elderly. One of our team members noted that in Barranquilla, the streets are only for the brave, meaning mostly for young men, are the people who feel most comfortable there. And we really need to create places that a broad variety of people can feel comfortable to capitalize on all those benefits of cities. Ideas about land use. So it's not just about mobility, but it's also about where you place living versus working and making sure that you're sort of reducing the need for people to commute. The impact of natural resources on the economy. Here, the linkage between trees and the local economy of masks that they use for their famous carnaval. And then the links between environment and agriculture, and the fact that in this particular place, climate change is really creating a lot of drought conditions. And even over the last 5 to 10 years, people are seeing significant changes to their yields. As well as, I think really interestingly in this case, the fact that, of course, cities like Barranquilla need to transition from an informal economy to a formal economy to begin to capture taxes and begin to create a more collective infrastructure. But there's also a lot of great things about the way the informal economy works in some of these places, a lot of great social benefits, and a lot of flexibility. And so it's a difficult problem, but keeping that in mind and trying to find ways that the informal economy can continue to function in some form has been a part of our discussions. And so through all of that, we basically developed 3 key actions for the metropolitan area. And each of them has a spatial impact. So the first one was to restore. This is a very special dry tropical forest habitat. It plays an important role in filtering salty air that comes from the Caribbean through the territory. And so we worked with the local university here and their habitat specialists to essentially identify those areas that should be protected and enhanced in terms of their ecological value, as well as those areas where we should keep the city back and make sure that development is curtailed. Then mobility, really key, both sort of leveraging the existing routes that sort of define the city and its growth patterns, but then also introducing new ones. So one of them is this ring that we called El Hilo, which runs between the first and the second ring roads of the city, which would really be the idea of a light rail line that is separated from grade and that either moves to go under or over obstacles, and that provides somebody like the woman on the farm who is living here. For her, she said that it takes her 3 hours to get from her farm here to the center of the city for a doctor's appointment. She needs to leave at 4:30 in the morning. And so with this ring and then last mile transit to it, you'd be able to get from anywhere in the city to anywhere else in the city within 45 minutes. And this is a concept that we worked very closely with our traffic engineering specialists from Italy, Systematica, on. And then with mobility and open space understood, this sort of pattern emerged for growth, this kind of finger pattern with a series of islands of growth that are all also defined by essentially a 15-minute walking radius. 7 projects for Barranquilla 2100. The first we called Electricidad, which is really about a street network that is powered by electricity, both for public transit, but also increasingly for electric bikes and scooters. So this is the very simple idea of taking legacy roadways, creating shade, providing charging stations for those forms of mobility, and being able to power that network while also making it much more pedestrian and bike friendly and sort of helping to grow those local economies in the process. Ciudad, which is about this idea of taking the old artificial canals and then naturalizing them, widening them, turning them into multi-purpose infrastructure. So in places like Barrio La Paz, which has a new park that's been built along this edge, really starting to expand that, create more space actually for stormwater capture, and then more value for the residents around, and new spaces to hang out. These areas, not sure if I can go back, these areas would flood during large rain events, but then during non-rain events, they'd be open for use. This was one of our favorites, the urban living rooms, which is the idea of taking existing industrial buildings and underused parcels in the center of neighborhoods and turning them into sort of gathering spaces that would be developed by the city. Places for shade, for markets, for dance and community events. Taking advantage of major infrastructure within the city itself. The city has a lot of stadiums, which have pretty good transit around them, but then using their underutilized spaces for parking and otherwise to create dense transit-oriented development. Connected with light rail. In places with a lot of risk, again, the barrancos are called to mind here. Barranquilla is actually called Barranquilla for its barrancos, which run along the hillside. There's a lot of informal development in these areas and a lot of landslide risk. And nobody has really been able to figure out what to do with these areas. So what we've proposed here is to start to formalize the development by creating dense housing along the edges of these areas, moving residents into those new housing developments, and then turning those former risk areas into new parkland along this, what's called La Ladera, this sort of lifeline running through the city that sits on a hill. And then finally, or next to finally, activating that industrial waterfront with a series of new neighborhoods that would each have a different focus. In this case, Barranquilla recently secured the Formula One for South America for this coming year. And so they're working very hard now on a Formula One track that will be built on this island with a park around it, which will then also set the framework for future development. This is currently under development today. And then sort of echoing El Hilo in the metropolitan area, thinking about how that could come into the city itself and really start to connect on a more efficient loop system those different areas of the city. So 7 projects for the metropolitan area. Looking at implementation over time and how that would happen. And I've just had this little puzzle piece show up, which is maybe telling me that that's a good place to end. I would love to go to my last slide, if I could. But if I can't, I'll just close with these remarks, which is that I think it's easy to look at places like Amsterdam and Copenhagen and think, oh, you know, they've been like that forever. 50 years ago, if you look at images of Amsterdam and Copenhagen, which I was going to show here, they look almost exactly the same as some of the most congested routes in places like Guatemala City or Los Angeles or what have you. And it's been through concerted policy, changes to infrastructure, that new way of living has been accomplished. And so I think you all are really in a great position here, having the will and having the knowledge to know that these are the things that you need to be looking at as a city. And we're very excited to be here and hope to work with you further on these really important ideas for the city. Thank you.